Good to have you with us, Doug. Initially, Doug, NATO had 12 founding members. Now there are 32. They're all bound, aren't they, by that solemn promise: an attack on one ally is an attack on all. Has that pledge stood the test of time?
On paper, it has, because just about not a day goes by right now where you don't have the NATO Secretary General, Jens Stoltenberg, or one of the members reiterating, as actually France's defense minister has just yesterday, that France will not tire of lending its support to Ukraine in fending off Russia's invasion, and will stay with Ukraine, you know the saying, as long as it takes. So on paper, absolutely, an attack against one is an attack against all. On paper, if Estonia, Latvia, or Lithuania, some of the smallest members of the alliance, were encroached upon by Russia, all the alliance would be there. Now, what about in practice? And this is where things get a little dicier, right? Because the theory is collective defense is at the heart of NATO's treaty, the charter. Its founding charter back then in 1949, and today, collective defense. Its three core tasks have always been the same, right? It's been deterrence and defense, crisis management and prevention, and collective security, with that emphasis on collective. And this is where it gets dicey. The war in Ukraine, as you said, has galvanized NATO. 32 members, as you pointed out, since Sweden and Finland were spurred to join by Russia's invasion of Ukraine. The war in Ukraine has galvanized NATO after what a lot of people say were decades of complacency and decline. Because basically it was formed in a Cold War time, right, when the real fear was of an assault, perhaps, an offense by the Soviet Union on Western Europe, on the U.S., so on and so forth. That mentality sort of, they got a little flabby, if you will, because there was no perceived threat, especially after the fall of the Berlin Wall, 1989, the collapse of the Soviet Union in the early 90s. And in recent years, they've had to basically build up their muscle again. They've had to whip themselves back into being a lean, mean machine. That is the climate in which this summit is getting together. But I have to underline, and its significance, Stuart, I said that it's about collective security. It is a defensive alliance. As much as Russia today and the Kremlin time and again relentlessly portrays NATO as an existential threat to Russia's security, as an offensive alliance about to attack, wanting to destroy Russia, it's simply not the case. It's not the case on paper, and it's not the case in NATO's public statements today. You could spin it however you want. It is true that NATO has expanded. It is true that NATO members are now literally on the border with Russia. But on paper and in their public statements, it remains a defensive alliance.
It's great watching these images while you're talking, Doug. They've been cutting a cake behind you, so I hope there are 32 pieces, enough for each country. We heard earlier as well, Doug, the French and Russian defense ministers had a phone conversation on Wednesday. It was disagreement on the matter of dialogue over Ukraine. Ukraine, of course, dominating really the actual official talks that have been going on here. And that focus has really been on how to trump-proof Ukraine. But what does that actually mean?
Let me first respond to what you said about that phone call. It wasn't really a disagreement over dialogue. It was, on the one hand, Russia creating facts that didn't exist, saying that France has agreed to sit down and have a dialogue about Ukraine's future under the so-called Istanbul Pact. In fact, France says nothing of the sort. We have not agreed to sit down and negotiate, which, as Russia sees it from the Western standpoint, is capitulation. Sitting down with Russia right now in negotiations, as Russia sees it, means accepting the Russian-occupied territories as part of Russia. That is a non-starter. So there is no agreement, not just a divergence. There is no agreement. France absolutely denying there was any agreement to talk and sit down and negotiate with Russia on Ukraine. Let's put that aside. What is Trump-proofing the alliance? Exactly that. It is making the alliance basically impervious to the prospect of Donald Trump's return to the White House in November, the prospect, right? It could happen, and the prospect of him retrenching into an isolationist posture. Basically, make America great again means basically dumping Europe, leaving the NATO allies to it, cutting loose. If that happens, NATO wants to be in a posture where, until now, it's been primarily dependent on the U.S., both for funding and for leadership. The two main proposals on the table: one, it would be a multi-year, a 5-year, 100 billion euro fund by the NATO members to help continue supporting Ukraine. Security assistance, arms, ammunition, and equipment over 5 years. has to be hammered out, where it's going to come from, how they're going to pay for it, who's going to give how much. And at the same time, restructuring the role in supplying those arms. Right now, the U.S. sort of has organized everything. It's called the Ramstein Group because they meet it at a base, a military base, U.S. base in Germany, the defense group. Europe wants to have more control now, more coordination control of that in the event, once again, that Trump comes to power. So NATO could basically have its hands on a lot of the supply of arms, ammunition, equipment. It won't be led and directed exclusively by the U.S. as it is now. I will just end with this. Yes, Stuart, as you can imagine, 32 members, it can be messy, and they're not all on board right now. Hungary has expressed reservations about anything that might smack of a more offensive posture that might provoke Russia, doesn't want to be part of that type of proposal. Italy has also said they're for it in principle, but who's going to give what how, that remains to be seen. The devil is in the details. Other countries, especially the Baltic states, very much in favor of NATO taking more responsibility, European members, for helping Ukraine down the road, because no one right now trusts that the U.S. guarantee is going to hold up in 6 to 8 to 9 months' time.
Yeah, once again, it certainly is getting very messy. They've been cutting that cake and starting to share it around in those images behind you while you were talking, those images coming into us from NATO headquarters in Brussels. Doug, thanks very much. Doug Herbert, our international affairs commentator here on France 24.